and then we will have more time to answer some of these questions. I'd like to introduce our next panelist, the host of the program that you guys have seen and probably know, Daniel Tutt, who is a PhD and is a professional lecturer in philosophy at George Washington University and a member of the Lacanian Forum of Washington, D.C. His writing has appeared in Historical Materialism, Philosophy Now, and multiple book collections on psychoanalysis and contemporary culture. He has degrees in philosophy from American University and the European Graduate School, and his research is concerned with the interaction of contemporary politics and Marxism and Lacanian psychoanalysis. Daniel, very good to have you here, and we are all eager to listen to your talk. The floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you very much. Okay, wonderful. So my talk today is hopefully going to be a timely intervention. We have, as I think many of you are probably aware, somewhat of a kind of political crisis within the kind of broader Lacanian community. And one of the things that Gabriel's work really brings out, especially in the very notion of Lacanian ideology, is the precise way of this, we could almost say supremacy, both of the analyst, but also a kind of supremacy of what psychoanalysts presume the clinic's function is. And from that presumption, how then Lacanians judge political phenomena. This is the kind of basis of my talk. So I'm going to read the talk, and it's called Psychoanalysis in Close Touch with Psychoanalysis, which is a play on an article which is fairly widely read by Jacques-Alain Miller called Psychoanalysis in Close Touch with the Social. I'm going to spend most of my time actually diagnosing some of the theoretical analyses of Miller. So let me begin. If one spends enough time in Lacanian circles, you come across a kind of division within the wider field, which I mentioned earlier, between analyst orientations to Lacanian thought, or those who practice psychoanalysis in a clinical setting, compared to critical philosophers who work with the Lacanian insights in philosophy or other areas of critical thought. I believe that this division is an under-theorized point of tension. And one of the ways that I understand the importance of Gabriel's The Desire of Psychoanalysis is precisely as a kind of bridge between these two. Although, as mentioned, I don't wish to suggest this is a hard and a fast division. However, one way this has played out is in the persistence, in fact, of the very significant contributions of the Slovene school of Lacanian thought, represented by Mladen Dolar, Alenka Zupančič, and Slavoj Žižek, and others, who at a certain point in time, according to Žižek, refused, in fact, to establish a clinical presence for Lacanian psychoanalysis in Slovenia, despite the fact that Miller had made this request, or maybe even made this demand upon Žižek and others, to, in fact, become analysts. And Žižek says this offer was rejected. Instead, in lieu of this, they insisted to remain philosophers working with certain problems that Lacan opens, okay? I believe one way to think about the significance of Gabriel's work is that it constitutes one of the first, although not only, first real clinical interventions that aims to distill the insights of the Slovene school, in addition to the insights of Kojun Karatani, specifically Karatani's notion of bracketing, Alain Badiou's theory of the generic, and other philosophical insights. Tupinamba's effort is very ambitious. It proposes a new psychoanalytic theory of transference, of the past, and at the end of analysis. And it proposes a new understanding of the very structure of psychoanalysis as an institution. Yet these bold proposals face an immediate challenge, given that they remain speculative. That is, at the moment, much of this kind of refoundational critique he's offering is in some sense untested clinically. Now, given the kind of political and I would say generational winds of change that are afoot in contemporary Lacanian thought, I think now is the time for Lacanians to think big and to address the core of the very model of Lacanian psychoanalysis, not merely to ask if this model is working, but to ask the deeper question of its very status as an institution and theoretical body of thought. I think that the Desire of Psychoanalysis begins, therefore, with a premise which promises a certain reparative treatment to the aforementioned divide, political divide and generational divide amongst Lacanians today. Namely, that the Desire of Psychoanalysis refers not only to the singular desire of the analyst, which is at stake in the clinic, but it aims to open up this singular desire of both analyst and analyst to participate in the idea of the unconscious. This is what the Desire of Psychoanalysis refers to. In the very idea of what Tupinambá calls the Desire of Psychoanalysis, we are presented with a vision of the institution which is not solely structured around the desire of the analyst, but of both analyst and and towards a different conception of transference of the past, and I might add, of the very status of belief in the unconscious, for which I will mention in a moment. He's relying here on Zizek's very central and very often overlooked theoretical elaboration of the subject supposed to believe, which is a kind of homology of the subject supposed to know. And finally, in the way he's treating the mathematical conception of infinity through the development of a third sphere of otherness, a generic otherness, the other, we have here the makings of a complete overhaul of the psychoanalysis as an institution. So if such a division between critical orientations and analyst orientations is not merely a fantasy, I think that in some sense, the weakness, perhaps, of the philosophical perspective is presumed that because philosophers possess less rigorous understanding of, like as Gabriel mentioned, less capacity for listening to the speech of analysans, they therefore may be in a less ideal or privileged place to use Lacanian thought to make an analysis of social or political dynamics. Clinicians, on the other hand, are presumed to possess a more privileged clarity of psychoanalysis given their training and unique access to the clinic on a day-to-day basis. So in a technical sense, the clinical perspective at a purely prima facie point of view is assumed to have a kind of greater touch with social and political dynamics. Now, but I believe that this division and the assumptions that go into it, which are kind of, I think, in Lacanian circles, an almost unsaid tension, is preceded by a prior dynamic, which Gabriel's already mentioned is called what he calls Lacanian ideology. So what is Lacanian ideology? We can define it as the generalization of the logic of the signifier outside of the context of the regional spaces where free association is instantiated in analysis. It is a movement from the regional space where the quote unquote reporting function is suspended for the speech of the analysand into the wider social field, to speech in general, wherein we get a dynamic in which psychoanalysis arrogates a mode of truth unto itself. That is, psychoanalysis speaks of science, for example, on its own terms, or of love on its own terms, or it speaks of politics on its own terms, you see? That's one effect. I think the other effect of Lacanian ideology, what I want to focus on with Miller, is that it circumscribes the analyst from the field of analysans and perpetuates a kind of unspoken series of hierarchical divisions that are taken to be naturalized as such. So if this then kind of begs the question, how do Lacanians tend to address social and political dynamics, given Gabriel's thesis at the beginning, which is there seems to be a kind of conservative orientation in today's Lacanian thought? Why is that the case? I want to identify two tendencies in analysts, and these are general comments. I'm not targeting anyone in particular here. When it comes to how analysts actually analyze social and political phenomena, I think number one is the analyst sort of channeling Lacan presumes to have an almost crystal ball, a kind of a capability of diagnosis of social symptoms. And I think this is a kind of extreme tendency, which is almost a kind of adoption of Lacan's own tendency. And this is embodied by Miller, in my opinion. On the other hand, I think there's an even more common tendency whereby social and political dynamics are basically treated as being in the same or similar condition in which Lacan, especially in his later work, diagnosed them. Lacan, as we know, diagnosed our era as the decline of the name of the father and the collapse of a certain configuration of the superego that is broadly patriarchal. So therefore, very little social or political analysis is necessary, given that the late Lacan provides a kind of general contours of the disorder of the symbolic, right? And the kind of chaos of our epoch. Yeah? Now, I would claim that this latter approach, where social and political situations are thought to be composed in a way which is not much different than Lacan's own time, has actually gone to harm the very capacity for Lacanian field to derive new insights into its own model, its own clinical model. In fact, I have seen, and I don't know if you all agree, a tendency for those of us Lacanians to read the Lacan of Joyce, the Lacan of the later period, where he provides a notion of this of a new conception of the unconscious, what's called the parlette. I have seen analysts and many Lacanians refer to this period of Lacan's thought almost as if it's a kind of prognostication of the future, as if Lacan was almost a kind of Nostradamus, where we're still working with figuring out how the consequences of his insights at this time. But again, I think such an orientation poses a kind of self-limitation of theoretical novelty. So therefore, I want to claim that a proper understanding of the social and political fields actually depends upon performing a kind of separation of an otherwise fetishized view of Lacan's own unique touch with the social and political dynamics of his time and of our time. Now, with that, it bears asking, what precisely were the political commitments of the later Lacan? Was Lacan in touch with the political dimension? And to what extent was he? I suggest here two things. First of all, I believe that many Marxist Lacanians would benefit from working more with the later Lacan, the Lacan of Joyce, who presents a new theory of the real unconscious, where the body is very much centered over the logic of signifier. There is a Marxist politics present in this period, and there is also what Jean-Claude Milner has referred to as a latent liberal political humanism. This orientation of thinking of Lacan as a fundamentally liberal political humanitarian in his orientation, according to Milner, has to do with the historical knowledge of the horrors of communist regimes, Stalinism and Maoism in particular, which became widely known in the late 1970s. This resulted, according to Milner, in Lacan to sort of return to, and he even makes a very interesting point, which is that the very tripartite structure of the Borromean clinic, or the kind of three spheres, Lacan in some sense mapped those onto the liberal philosopher Victor Cousins, who was a kind of state philosopher under the Napoleonic regime. And so that everything had to do with the proper distribution of enjoyment within a kind of terminal liberal order. So the immediate thing from a Marxist point of view is that such a vision is almost a kind of end of history liberal capitalist deterministic tragedy. I wish to point out that Alain Badiou, in his seminars, which were later published as Theory of the Subject, makes a very interesting point where he criticizes Lacan's theory of the end of analysis as itself a compromised, what we might say, liberal bourgeois conception of the individual, and going so far as to saying that Lacan adopted a kind of theory of ordinary unhappiness, which he identifies with a sort of wider American ideology. There was a lecture that Lacan gave in Chicago where Badiou basically says that thinking of the end of analysis as a return to the great dialectic of courage and justice in this kind of Greek tragic mode was basically put off the table, okay? Of course, as we know, one of the ways we can think about Badiou's wider work on the theory of the subject, not only in theory of the subject, but beyond in logics of worlds and being an event and so on, is that he's used the Lacanian notion of the end of analysis as a homology to think a broader conception of the subject, right? However, even in the late Lacan, despite this, let's say, terminal liberalism, there is a kind of opening for a kind of Marxist reading, okay? And I'll just say a couple brief things here. So Milner makes the point in a wonderful article on the political thought of the late Lacan, which is in Crisis and Critique, makes the point that the best way in which we can conceive of the Lacan of the parlette, of the speaking being, of the emphasis on the body, is that the whole theory of surplus, which we have from seminar 16 and seminar 17, where Marx becomes, as Samo Tomczyk has mentioned, a kind of primary interlocutor. Marx's theory of surplus and its relationship to the body and enjoyment is still present in the late Lacan, right? I think it's also worth noting that there is a kind of subversive and emancipatory way to read Lacan as well, even stretching back to his presentation in television, which is itself almost a prophetic statement. You'll remember where he notes that jouissance in the future will become increasingly treated in terms of segregation. This is due to the intensification of the discourse of capitalism across the world. So it's almost a kind of thesis of globalization and the hegemony, if you like, of capitalist discourse will itself produce certain effects on the body, right? That is, through a Marxist lens of surplus value, one must have a body in order to sell their labor power. So surplus and body become synonymous in the universe of the discourse of the capitalist. The more of surplus value, the more that surplus jouissance derives from the same structure. So we have here a kind of a way in which we can read Lacan in a commitment to a kind of Marxist orientation, combined with the threat of this fundamentally, say, liberal conservatism. Okay. Now, the next section of my talk is called Circumscribing the Place of Psychoanalysis and the Social. So perhaps one of the most problematic effects of Lacanian ideology is found in Lacan's theory of the four discourses. As we know, each discourse composes a social link, and the four discourses are in fact a brilliant way to show the way in which each discourse produces a specific solution to the impasse of the social relation. As we know, each discourse is founded on the master's discourse, and the psychoanalyst discourse, or the discourse of the analyst, is located on the opposite side of the master's discourse. A master signifier, therefore, is what creates a discourse, like a hook or a quilting point. In the master's discourse, it is the S1 that is in the position of agency, whereas in the discourse of the analyst, it is desire, which is in the place of agency. Now, the analyst discourse makes desire singular for the subject, and Tupinambá shows the way in which Lacan's development of the discourse of the analyst emerged in part as an answer to an original and perceived impurity of the desire of the analyst, for which I think Gabriel makes a brilliant point, which is one way to read why in the ethics seminar Kant is invoked has everything to do with this question of resolving the status of the desire of the analyst, and the Kantian notion of purity and impurity of ethics become very central. It's also very useful to note that in 1964, at the founding of his school, there was an unaddressed question which was posed by Louis Althusser about the very status of the analysand in the composition of Lacan's school. But what Althusser suggested was that the status of the analysand is equivalent to the status of the masses. And here we're thinking in this kind of way in which the masses, even in a Maoist sense, used to have a kind of viability, right? The peasantry was a kind of agency, which was, as we know, out ahead of the party, out ahead of the logic of the party. So therefore, Althusser provided an advice which was never fully incorporated into the very status of Lacan's clinic, right? On the other hand, the analyst discourse also became a means by which the notion of the analytic act or the interpretive gesture at the end of the analysis came to be imbued with a certain power which was reserved for the analyst, and most especially reserved for Lacan himself, right? We should note also that the analyst discourse, since Seminar 17, has afforded Lacan a certain political privilege, right? He says famously in television that the analyst discourse is that which is capable of fending off the pernicious rise of the fifth discourse of the capitalist discourse, precisely because the discourse of capitalism proposes a social bond in which castration is not a necessary condition. The discourse of the analyst, therefore, is in some sense a lighthouse to the corrosive lack of a social bond in a world run amok by the discourse of capitalists. I believe it's important to note here, when we speak of the divide between the social and the clinic, this is not to be understood as a naive binary. The social is not outside of the clinic or outside of subjective circumstances, but rather the inverse. It is the clinic that allows access to the social because it is the place where the subject confronts the social most directly. That is, in the unconscious. And we know from Lacan, the unconscious is politics. One of the most important contributions of Tupinambá's work here is that what he's giving us is a kind of new framework for understanding this strange challenge of how precisely we read and we periodize some of the wider concepts of Lacan, from the discourses to the objet a, to the pass, to the subject supposed to know. What is it that ties these conceptual innovations together is what he calls structural dialectics. Structural dialectics is therefore a model of analysis that presupposes an alterity of one and the other, which places certain limits on this very theory or very status of otherness, right? And what we're left with is kind of two modes of thinking otherness: transferential otherness and the radical alterity of the real of desire. Structural dialectics therefore places a primacy on otherness, or the dimension that conceives of a possible otherness, which is not primitive, or which is not a primitive other, which is fundamentally abyssal. So in what follows, I want to show the way in which structural dialectics is present in the thought of Miller. And I want to examine how Miller theorizes not only the social, but also the civilizational crisis of our time. That is, how does Miller raise the problem of the antagonism of our civilization? So if Lacanian ideology is at work, we would no doubt detect it in the very proposal that psychoanalysts privilege to themselves to have a unique vantage on diagnosing the civilizational discontents. Miller's thought, although it is of course brilliant and of a crucial importance to the Lacanian field for many reasons, is also a case in point for why Tupinambá's analysis is so important for offering an alternative to this. So what does Miller say about the civilizational crisis of our time? Well, he has said since the mid-1990s that society is no longer organized around a master signifier, an S1, but that our compass and the term he uses is the dominant place in our civilization, is that of the objet A. So taking up Lacan's suggestion in Encore and elsewhere that industrially produced surplus jouissance produces, quote, a completely different imperative, jouir, Miller argues that this imperative to enjoy is the superego of our civilization. In our time, quote, it is both men and women who are defined by their isolation in jouissance. Their withdrawal is therefore the rise of the logic of the objet A to the very status of what the social is. Therefore, the place of surplus jouissance is a place where small bits of enjoyment are scattered, and the subject, or the analysand, has no access to what he calls the infinite source of enjoyment. He says that what is inscribed at this place is a false real. Everything is there. Analysands, on the other hand, have no access to another side of this enjoyment. It is a kind of maxim of Miller that our civilization is one in which the other no longer exists. Analysts thus have the task of inventing the other, because the other is the place of the social, after all. Miller says, quote, it was the epoch in which social insertion was accomplished primarily through symbolic identification. It was at this time in which analysands could prone the liberation of desire and find a certain salvation through the drive. But no longer is this the case. In our current epoch, which he, as a kind of aside, there is a sort of periodization that he provides here based on a certain hegemony of an American logic of a kind of certain latent utilitarianism, right? So in other words, analysts come to the clinic and they no longer ask the same question that they asked, say, in 68, or at the time in which we had a different civilizational arrangement. In other words, they no longer have the desire for a complete restructure, a complete overhaul, and so on. Rather, there's a kind of overly practical question posed to the analyst, which is, how does this work, right? It's a kind of a desire for a know-how. It's not a desire for a destruction. Although, of course, with that said, part of the crisis, according to Miller, in my view, is that this shift, in a paradoxical sense, he wishes to maintain it. In other words, if you read his latest piece, the trans docility article, which was a monstrous article, in my opinion, you note very interestingly how he makes a kind of homologous connection between the trans phenomenon today and precisely what the desire of the 68 protesters presented, right? So in a paradoxical sense, you have in the trans phenomenon instantiated the very same dynamic that Lacan was responding to in his famous seminar 17, to the anarchist and communist students that took over his seminar, right? I believe in short that Miller's description of our world is one in which psychoanalysis is arrogating to itself the privilege for the establishment of a new master signifier, of a new logic by which we might get out of this otherwise limited form of enjoyment. That a space in which psychoanalytic practice is established by analysts, this is not in dispute. What I think is in dispute, rather, is the way in which Miller arrogates to himself and to the Lacanian community a kind of privileged mode of analysis of, for example, being able to say what the primary symptom of our civilization is, as if there is a kind of unified civilization in which the analyst can uniquely identify this. I think this is a problematic point, and I think that Tupinambá's theory of Lacanian ideology is in fact encapsulated in this very gesture of Miller's. In a telling way, apropos this ideology, Miller writes, quote, psychoanalytic effects do not depend on the setting, They depend on the discourse. That is, they depend on the installation of the symbolic coordinates, and here is an important point, of someone who is an analyst, and of someone whose quality as an analyst does not depend on the location of his consulting room, nor the nature of his clients, but rather on the experience he's engaged in. We thus have a situation in which the social, of course, is absent, and analysans are incapable of accessing what he calls infinite jouissance, and there is therefore an absent desire of liberation, again replaced by this utilitarian American concern with the how-to. In Malaire's analysis, we should notice that psychoanalysis is not only a privilege itself to be the point at which we can make analyses of civilization. This orientation has led Malaire in the momentous political year of 2017 to write a text in which he dramatically named in 2017 Freudian Field Year Zero. In this text, he claims that the wider network of schools, of his schools, were threatened by the populist situation in France, of a possible upending of the rule of law if either the far left or the far right were to be victorious. But Malaire goes even further than this, and he places the analyst, in this case, his own position as the chief analyst of the schools, as partially responsible for this disarray in the political field of his own schools, because he personally lost transference with them. Now, the way in which psychoanalysis regains its efficacy is through the establishment of what Malaire, in a very perhaps ironic way, calls the establishment of alpha places. Alpha places. And again, this is in his article, Psychoanalysis in Close Touch with the Social. And where he says what determines the efficacy of psychoanalytic effects, he says, quote, the Lacanian concepts of the analytic act, the analytic discourse, and the conclusion of an analysis as a pass to the analyst have permitted us to conceive of the psychoanalyst as a nomad object, and to conceive of psychoanalysis as a portable installation capable of moving into new contexts, and in particular into new institutions. The accounts given of cases show and demonstrate and bring into evidence that specifically psychoanalytic effects are produced within institutional contexts whenever this context authorizes the installation of an analytic place. There is an analytic place possible in institution. Let us call this an alpha place. So alpha places are instantiations of analysis wherein, quote, direct contact with the social comes into existence. In the alpha place, analysans are in a place of discontact with the social. So the alpha place is what can put psychoanalysis into the position to be able to determine psychoanalytic basis of symptoms within the wider social field. And Malaire, I think to his credit, has tried to elaborate a certain notion of the clinic, which comes out of the late Lacan, what he calls the clinic of irony, which might actually go beyond and rival the very status of the predominance of the DSM. So I think that there are some very provocative ways in which Malaire has sought to further the expansion of some of the insights of a later Lacan's notion of the clinic. But the problem that I have here, the question that I have, is that psychoanalysis, while it lacks alpha places, that is the supposed means by which it can make a diagnosis, it lacks that, yet from where then can the psychoanalyst still make these bombastic claims about the trans phenomenon presenting the kind of threat to our civilizational impasse? This to me seems, if in the very notion of Lacanian ideology, it seems to me to be a case in point of it. One of the big focuses of Gabriel's text is the question of how psychoanalysis establishes a new master signifier or produces a new harmony capable of opening up a different form of being in the world. And this is a question which us on the Lacanian left have really grappled with, I would say, since Ernesto Laclau's work on hegemony theory in its orientation to emancipatory politics. And of course, many other interventions have done this. That is, how do we take and derive a kind of generalization of the notion within the political field of the establishment of a discourse of socialist emancipation, which would kind of reset or in an eventual sense kind of provide the coordinates for a completely new organization of enjoyment, right? So I think what Gabriel makes a very significant correction here, which is one could quite easily ask the question, are left-oriented Marxist Lacanians falling sway to the same sloppy Lacanian ideology, which is this kind of generalization of the logic of signifier when they're making an analysis? And what Gabriel shows, apropos Zizek's theory of ideology and Zizek's theory of subject supposed to believe, is that it's not victim to the same Lacanian ideology, rather because it is a generalization of the Lacanian theory of transference, which does not presuppose a kind of structural application in all settings, right? You don't see people like Slavoj making these bombastic claims about a symptom of civilization as such, right? Zizek's theory of the subject supposed to believe is therefore exempted from Lacanian ideology, precisely in that it is founded as, quote, an alternative generalization of the ontological presuppositions of Lacan's theory of the transference. So unlike Malher's diagnosis of our time as the one of inexistence of the other, Zizek's subject supposed to believe is a theory about what is possible. It's not about the structure of every situation. And furthermore, what Tupinambá brilliantly shows is that the subject supposed to believe actually opens up a possibility of a new form of thinking otherness, which is beyond structural dialectics, right? In other words, it is beyond the status of thinking ordinary unhappiness as tied to an overly subjective mode at the end of analysis, but is actually proposing a new theory of a field of otherness, what Gabriel calls generic otherness, which is in fact located in the clinic itself. So I want to kind of conclude by looking at this third form of otherness. So instead of modeling the clinic off of a generalized theory of the alpha place, in which a theory of transference is reliant on only two forms of otherness, the small and the big other, Tupinambá deploys Zizek's supposed to believe as a third form, as the psychoanalytic institution itself. The psychoanalytic institution is, quote, an other, which is capable of rendering consistent and transmissible what neither transference nor the discontents of culture are capable of properly naming. So therefore, instead of arrogating a kind of heroic and impossible task to the analyst to constantly wage a battle with a compromised social field in which infinite jouissance is foreclosed and so on, in this model, Tupinambá proposes an institution that would be capable of producing ideas that have, and this is most important, an epistemological autonomy from psychoanalysis itself and from the field of culture. In other words, what the generic theory of the psychoanalytic institution allows for is for a greater sense of separation so that analysts no longer presuppose an almost imperial power of perception of social and political dynamics. Rather, we think about the clinic in what Badiou would call a space of compossibility. That is, we open ourselves to thinking about the truths of psychoanalysis that are produced in the clinic, not always on our own terms, but you know this beautiful notion of Badiou of the four conditions of love, art, science, politics. I think Gabriel's idea here is building off of this notion of this kind of space of compossibility, right? And so this is very significant, and I believe that Tupinambá is shifting the ground in so many ways, which, to be honest, we're not even fully at the place in which we can incorporate the novelty of what it is that he's actually proposing. I think that there's a certain boldness in this new theory of otherness that allows us to exit this otherwise circumspect model of structural dialectics, which really has limited the way in which psychoanalysis speaks to other fields. And I think also it redefines, and this is an important point, although it's a sensitive point, it redefines the relationship of analyst to analysans by inscribing both into the hypothesis of the unconscious, right? From the very beginning of the analytic process, by redefining the desire of psychoanalysis as, quote, constructing within psychoanalytic thinking the perspective from which analysans and analysts are counted as one. I believe psychoanalysis can emerge as a historical and generic procedure, and therefore open up a space in which we can think of the autonomous generation of new ideas from the clinic itself. So this generic procedure turns itself into a consistent and consequential object of inquiry at the cost of making it impossible to tell who is engaging with it, the analyst or the analysand. So he's proposing a kind of indistinction in the relationship between the two. And this has the contribution that it de-hierarchizes psychoanalysis. So in some sense, it's deprivileging the supremacy of the discourse of the analyst, or rather recomposing it, I would say. So if we return to the question of how can psychoanalysis propose a new master signifier, we see that this question depends on psychoanalysis's capacity to uphold this wider cycle of invention of a single case, but of the clinic itself. And we think about it as binding the clinic not only to metapsychology, but also to a new theory of an institution which is capable of creating ideas in what Gabriel calls the sphere of love. So with this expanded positioning of psychoanalysis, what we are afforded is a new way to think love itself as a generic procedure. I want to read a nice passage from the Desire of Psychoanalysis, where Gabriel writes, if instead of grasping it as a hypothesis that situates a precise clinical position, we privilege what this premise entails for situations in general, then psychoanalysis emerges as an essentially critical procedure, a new metapsychological perspective on desire and subjectivity, which potentially affects every field of human thinking and practice. There is this, the practical existence of psychoanalysis cannot take the form of cases. It rather exists as a constellation of examples, clinical, ideological, artistic, or ontological settings which attest to the existence and the effect of the logic of the unconscious. So you see the important move here. What he's proposing is that psychoanalysis expands its very register beyond merely the case studies. And I think it's important to note that in Lacanian thought today, when was the last time you saw a paradigmatic case study? It's very rare. I mean, there's complex theoretical reasons this is the case. But I think what is nice here is that utilizing Zizek's theory of the example, one of the things that Gabriel does is show that examples from the novelty of the clinic can be expanded. So I'm going to conclude with a section which is called Love in the Generic Key. Lacan wrote in the Écrit a famous and often quoted line where he said, psychoanalysis alone recognizes the knot of imaginary servitude that love must always untie anew or sever. So if we return to this question of the humanist Lacan of his later years of teachings, we can see that it is surplus enjoyment which situates a certain return to an emphasis on the body, and that the problem becomes precisely how the distribution of enjoyment is in fact a political crisis. Now, in Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud makes the famously anti-communist claim that the persistence of a society governed by private property retains a necessary aggressivity of man. That is, in classical liberal form, Freud says that a society without private property runs the risk of failing to provide a certain outlet for common resentments and aggressiveness. What I wish to propose is that the generic perspective that Gabriel opens allows us to rethink this dynamic. It's not only through his elaboration of a new model of how psychoanalytic ideas are generated and the effects that has on the hierarchy of the clinic, a generic theory of love can also emerge here. And I think that this allows us to envision a new way to handle this fundamental aggression of civilization. For example, how might a generic orientation address the aggressiveness outlet problem which Freud worries about? It is Lacan, after all, who said that love is an affect capable of humanizing monstrous enjoyment. And I would argue that this humanization of love is what enables psychoanalysis to think politics with a certain rapport with the very desire of psychoanalysis that Gabriel is proposing. But such an investigation into the ways a new form of political love that would be informed by psychoanalysis, I believe this holds the key to a form of life beyond the kind of liberal finitude and beyond the kind of constant capture of surplus that we face today. So I will close with that.
Wonderful, wonderful talk, Daniel. It was very informative. Opened many, many aspects that I personally had not thought, and it gives us new perspectives. It is right now, according to my time, 12:48. I think this is a very good time to take a short break. We have another presenter, Agon, that will present right after the break. But I think probably, given the time that we have, a 5 minutes break for people just to take a bio breaks. These
Sounds
are
great.
heavy. I think it's time. We are back to our panel. Our next speaker is Agon Hamza. I'd like to introduce Agon. Agon is a wonderful friend. He's a PhD in philosophy and is an assistant professor of political philosophy at ISSHS. He's an author of a number of books, reading Marx with Frank Uda and Slavoj Žižek, Althusser and Pasolini, Philosophy, Marxism, and Film, From Myth to Symposium, The Case of Kosovo with Slavoj Žižek. In addition, he's the editor of Althusser and Theology, Religion, Politics, and Philosophy, and Repeating Žižek, as well as a co-editor with Frank Uda and of Slavoj Žižek and Dialectical Materialism. He's the founder and co-editor with Frank Uda of the International Philosophy Journal, Crisis and Critique, Reading Hegel with Slavoj Žižek and Frank Uda, which is forthcoming in Polity. And Agon has an active political life. He was a political advisor to the Prime Minister of the Republic of Kosovo. Agon, thank you very much for coming to this panel. We are all enthusiastic to listen to your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Reza. Good to see you. Good to see you, Daniel. It's an honor to be here. Thanks to Daniel for this invitation. Also, being amongst Lacanians is a pretty tricky thing. Being a philosopher and not directly affiliated with any Lacanian school, I want to take a slightly different path in my discussion. In first and third chapter, Gabriel engages with the work of Louis Althusser and his relationship to Lacan and psychoanalysis in general. We already know that Althusser's conception of ideology, which he defined as representation of an imaginary relations of individuals to their real conditions of existence, is indebted to Lacan's mirror stage. And Lacan's concept of surplus enjoyment is indebted to Althusser's various readings of Marx. But this is another topic of discussion. What I want to discuss here today is the relationship between these two thinkers. Let me begin by referring to Althusser's monstrous autobiography, The Future Lasts Forever. Discussing his rather strange relationship with Jacques Lacan, Althusser refers to the concept of the letter always arrives at its destination. This is diametrically opposed to his conceptualization of a materialist philosopher who jumps on a moving train without having an idea where it has come from or where it is going. Althusser thought Lacan's concept was correct, but so was his. But this matter got all the more complicated by a young Hindu doctor who underwent an analysis with Lacan. Apparently, he was courageous enough to ask Lacan the following. You say a letter always reaches its addressee. However, Althusser, however, says exactly the opposite. What are your views of what he calls his materialist argument? Lacan's answer was short. Althusser isn't a practicing analyst. Here is the main difference between the two thinkers, at least according to Althusser. Lacan spoke as a practicing analyst, and I as a practicing philosopher. Althusser maintains that philosophy and psychoanalysis are two different fields which in no way can be reducible to one another. In his powerful essay on Marx and Freud, Althusser situates Marxism and psychoanalysis within the same field of conflictual sciences. Both disciplines exist within the conflict that they theorize. As he puts it, there is the simple postulate that in necessarily conflictual reality, such as society, one cannot see everything from everywhere. The essence of this conflictual reality can only be discovered on the condition that one occupies certain positions and not others in the conflict itself. For to passively occupy other positions is to allow oneself to participate in the logic of dominant ideology. The end of quote. To clarify this point, in any conflictual situation or reality, there is no such a thing as a neutral position. In each and every social conflict, occupying the position of the neutral observer, one is always already and necessarily within the position of the ruling class or of the oppressors. When in Capital, Marx writes that this book represents the proletariat, he is thereby declaring that the book can be understood only if one occupies the position of the proletariat. The same goes for the distinction between workers and proletarians. One becomes a proletarian when one subjectively recognizes him or herself to belong to those ranks. Now this paves the way further. In March when Lacan decides to dissolve his school, this paves the way to elaborate on when Lacan decides to dissolve his school. This problem is developed at length in Tupinambá's book, but I want to quote Althusser because I think his point is very pertinent, and also perhaps it serves as the core of the book we are discussing this evening. In this event, Althusser showed up uninvited. This is how reports on the affair, which surprisingly was interpreted both by his followers as well as by Lacanians as a sign of his absolute madness. Quote, whatever the case, I told them, in point of fact, you're doing politics and nothing else. You are in a process of doing politics and nothing else. In any event, when one does politics, as Lacan and you are doing it, it is never without consequences. If you think you are not doing any, wait a little. It will come crashing down on your heads, or rather, and alas, it won't come crashing down on your heads since you are well protected and know how to lie low. And further, it is a political act, and such an act is not taken alone, as Lacan did, but should be reflected on and discussed democratically by all the interested parties, in the first rank of which are your masses, who are your analysants, your masses and your real teachers. which the analysants are, and not by a single individual in the secrecy of 5 Rue de Lille. Otherwise, it's despotism, even if it is enlightened. The end of quote. One can note the Maoist tones and vocabulary employed by Althusser: masses, real teachers, etc. Chapter 3 of the Desire of Psychoanalysis offers a detailed and in-depth analysis of this problematic. Tupinambá understands this quite correctly, in my view, as if Lacan performed an analytic act by proposing the dissolution of the school. The analytic act is a gesture of an analytic process. Following Althusser's denunciation of dissolution, Tupinambá is right to call this a political act because it had an effect on the entire community, and as such, for the reason and the manner in which it was done, and because it claimed itself as non-political, it was non-democratic. To write about Althusser is to write about a communist militant who also did philosophy, something one cannot ascribe to Lacan or his immediate successor Miller. This is not so much a critique of Lacan as it is a critique of Lacanian ideology that Tupinambá sets out to critique, especially through the non-relation between analysis and politics. The first difference, or the lack of this articulation between Althusser and Lacan, consists on the articulation of epistemological versus ontological questions. Writing on or reading Althusser as a communist militant who also did philosophy is the crucial element as the true difficulty in rereading his own work, regardless on the seasonal trend which is currently declaring him to be relevant. In our neurotic obsessive predicament, the true philosophical gesture is to avoid both the newly founded loves or what is currently philosophically fashionable. From the standpoint of historical materialism, far more interesting than critiquing these trends and to a certain degree pointing out on their falsity is to focus on reading and interpreting them as indicators par excellence of the work of ideology in our situation. Again, it is easy to demonstrate the limits of Althusser, and many have done so, but it is much more productive to engage with precisely those limits and work through them. There is only one way in which we can understand Althusser's work, Marxists too, for that matter. In other words, it is only from the proletarian position in philosophy and in politics that one can read and understand Marxism in general and Althusser included. In older times, this position had a name. It was called a partisan position. Althusser's work stood for a double breakthrough. On one hand, he was able to break away with the orthodox Marxism and fight against the spontaneous ideology of after 68 capitalism. So my following thesis runs something like this. The return of Althusser in the contemporary philosophical political conjuncture means the confrontation with that kind of current of the left which has abandoned the difficult task of rethinking the difficult Marxist categories: exploitation, class formation, class struggle, etc. In this regard, it is our task to proceed from where he left off. This said, I want to focus on something more interesting, on dialectical materialism as understood and conceptualized by Althusser and Lacan's critique of the latter. The relationship between Althusser and Lacan is controversial and certainly not clarified in terms of philosophical overlappings and influences, as well as the formation of the thinkers based on the writings of one another. This means that my aim is not to reconstruct the Althusser-Lacan relation, the influences of one on another and vice versa. It will not concern itself with the concept of interpellation or many other concepts which are an object of various debates. One of the most point of concerns here is the intersection and the supplement between psychoanalysis and Marxism. One of the most common ways to understand this relation is to understand psychoanalysis as a supplement to Marxism. An almost classical example would be to take a situation in which the objective conditions for the revolution exists, but the revolution doesn't take place. Usually, it is expected that the psychoanalysis will provide a coherent explanation for this failure. Following this logic would imply that both psychoanalysis and Marxism are unattainable themselves, that both disciplines are in structural crisis, unable to answer to the new developments in our societies that need help from another discipline. There is another attempt which tries to couple Marxism and psychoanalysis. Ernesto Laclau, in his short text Psychoanalysis and Marxism, suggests that the only way to think the relation between psychoanalysis and Marxism is through what, following Heidegger, he calls destruction of the history of Marxism, which means going beyond classical concept of class, capital, etc. In other words, for Laclau, it is post-Marxism as a political field which can coexist, or more precisely, intersect with psychoanalysis. For him, the dialogue between the two disciplines is possible only under such a condition. Rejecting the two above mentioned cases might starts from this premise. There is no compatibility between Freud and Marx and Lacan and Althusser. One cannot read Marx and Freud fetish as the same or complementary concepts, or surplus value with surplus enjoyment. Although this can be more tricky, but I'm not getting into that. Nor simply trying to find sentences in Lacan and Marx which could serve as a support to one's argument. As a philosopher once said, everything resembles everything else in one or another way, but this simply means nothing. A much more refined dialectics should be put at work in order to reconcile both Freud, Lacan with Marx, Freud, Lacan with Marx, Hegel, Marx, Althusser, and so on, which goes well beyond the focus and the aim of this presentation. The structure of psychoanalysis and that of Marxism are different. It is unimaginable for analysts to revolt in the couch, as do workers in the factories. It is equally inconceivable for analysts to get organized in a union or a party like the proletariat does. There is no, how to put it, like natural affinity between the two disciplines. Let us proceed at another elementary level. The object of psychoanalysis is the unconscious, whereas for Marxism it is the class struggle. In this sense, it seems rather difficult to imagine a class struggle in the field of unconscious. This is the error of Wilhelm Reich, who attempted to locate the effects of the unconscious, Freud, with the effects of class struggle, Marx. For him, sexual liberation is associated also with the proletarian revolution. For Lenin, as well as for Althusser, although one can trace this back to Marx, the class struggles exist in three domains: economic, political, and economic, political, and ideological. Marxism is concerned with the class struggle and working class taking over the state power. In other words, Marxism aims to grasp the effects of the class struggle. On the other hand, psychoanalysis begins and is concerned with individuals and their sufferings. On Freud and Marx, Lacan argues that, like Marx, Freud offers us an example of thought in dialectical materialism. For Althusser, Freud is truly a materialist because he rejects the primacy of consciousness, whereas the use of the categories of displacement, overdetermination, condensation, and so on belong to the field of the dialectic. I think this is where Tupinambá makes an incredible move. He argues that Lacan conceived the problem of organization as the problem of institution. This reduction is profoundly problematic. What holds for psychoanalytic communities is true also for political organizations or other form or party form or anything else. To a certain extent, they're bound together by the figure of the master. No wonder that Lacan uttered the words "for those who love me" in his dissolution speech. I will skip this. Contemporary left dreams of a society in which social pathologies, neuroses, psychosis are eradicated, that the happy socialist paradise of equality also implies the well-being and happiness of all. But let us cite Freud. You will be able to conceive yourself that much will be gained if we succeed in transforming your hysterical misery into common unhappiness. With a mental life that has been restored to health, you will be better armed against that unhappiness. If we replace three words from Freud passage about the purposes of analysis with the purposes of communism, we get the following result. You will be able to conceive yourself that much will be gained if we succeed in transforming expropriation of labor into common unhappiness. With a social life like that has been with a social life that has been restored to justice, you will be better armed against that happiness. That is the whole point of communism should be to include discontent into society. Discontent as such will never disappear, but we can utilize it for more creative and progressive purposes. This brings us to a crucial dimension of Marxism and psychoanalysis, that of practices. But all this detour is not really unintentional. Tupinambá's book, as a central part, has a critique of Lacanian practice. And in order to address it, I think we first have to address the question of dialectical materialism, which surprisingly doesn't appear as a term in this book. But I think it is exercised throughout Tupinambá's work, not only in this present book, but in his other writing as well. In an essay called Materialist Dialectic, Louis Althusser defines practice from the standpoint of a certain notion of rule. All practices, theoretical and ideological included, transform a raw material into a determinate product. Departing from this, we could criticize the theory of transformation as being the notion of concrete labor in capitalism. Isn't the capitalist mode of production that has created the theory of abstract labor, which is this general pattern all activities are supposed to carry as their infrastructure, the pattern of transforming an indeterminate X into a determinate Y. What militant work requires a different theory of transformation in order to break away from the capitalist mode of production. Let us proceed further with the beginning of Althusser's essay, which is in line with the spirit of previous century Marxism. And he begins this important essay with a very complicated proposal, which in fact condenses the whole problematic of dialectical materialism. I shall call theory with capital T general theory, quoting Althusser, that is the theory of practice in general, itself elaborated on the basis of the theory of existing theoretical practices, which transforms into knowledges the ideological product of existing empirical practices. This theory is the materialist dialectic, which is none other than dialectical materialism. These definitions are necessary for us to be able to give an answer to this question. What is a use of a theoretical expression of a solution which already exists in the practical state? An answer with a theoretical basis. But one has to be aware that at a certain point in life, Althusser abandoned the concept of dialectical materialism in favor of materialism of the encounter. He goes as far as to argue that the entire horrors of Stalinism are in fact due to this theoretical monstrosity called dialectical materialism. It seems to have to do with nominalism, absolute homogeneity and immanence, all this in the same plane. By the theory of practice, we try to put all practice at the same level, but keep a certain difference between them, may not have been immanentist enough for his materialism, because it only rides at determinate moments, practice and theoretical practice, and not the indeterminate or aleatory ones, which he thinks nominalism can think or write more directly. We should move on in order to understand Althusser's in the line with the crisis of Marxism, which Althusser, while completely recognizing it, remained unquestionably loyal to communism and the proletariat position in philosophy. Thus, aleatory materialism, or materialism of the encountered, should be understood as his last attempt to rethink the communist project. What is materialism that Althusser defends in his late writings? In his autobiography, writing on Spinoza, Althusser says, he was also a nominalist, and Marx taught me that nominalism was the royal road to materialism. In fact, it leads only to itself, but it can think of hardly any more profound form of hardly any more profound form of materialism than nominalism. The end of quote. The basic thesis of nominalism is that there are only cases, which Althusser borrows from Wittgenstein's "The world is everything that is the case." For him, this is a suburb sentence. This suburb sentence says everything. When asked about his understanding and conceptualization of nominalism, and Marx's thesis that nominalism is an antechamber of materialism, but is materialism itself. But an unexpected critique emerges here in an, I think, unpublished so far seminar 18 from 1971. Lacan critiques Althusser from the standpoint of none other than dialectical materialism. Quote, if there is something that I am not, it is clear that I am not a nominalist. What I want to say is that my starting point is not that the name is something like a nameplate which attaches itself, just like that, onto the real. And one has to choose. If one is a nominalist, one has to renounce completely dialectical materialism, so that all in all, I evidently reject the nominalist tradition, which is effectively the only danger of idealism which can arise in a discourse like mine. The end of quote. But Lacan touches on one of the most important aspects of philosophical debate, precisely because he takes a position which is both anti-Foucault and anti-Althusser, only to mention the two. The sense in which Lacan is not a nominalist is, to quote, not to be a realist in the medieval sense, but in a sense that our scientific discourse can only find the real insofar as it depends on the function of the semblant. Reality is a semblant, but not in the simple sense that it is a deceptive appearance hiding true being. There is nothing, not true substantial real, behind the veil of phenomenal reality. Reality is a semblant in a sense that its structure already materializes a certain fantasy which obfuscates the real as a social antagonisms. For Lacan, there are not only particulars and the reality itself, but there are social antagonisms which do not exist as a case, but one has to refer to. And I will cut a few parts because I'm already spoken way too long. But why this long detour, which appears to neglect Tupinamba's book? Tupinambá proposed a new procedure of concluding, and I'll just say a couple of very brief remarks. Tupinambá proposed a new procedure of a concluding moment in the psychoanalytic process. He sees this not only as a limit of the psychoanalytic treatment, but of Lacan himself. There is something interesting about the approach of some psychoanalysts to psychoanalytical treatment, and I've been experiencing this lately quite a bit. They reduce it to only a clinical experience. This is similar to those Marxists who seek pure communism or uh, clean socialism. But to go back to the final remark, psychoanalysis, according to Tupinambá, should be thought in three dimensions: the clinical, psychological, and institutional domains. I understand Tupinambá discusses class struggle with regard to partition between those who can financially afford and not the analytic process in order to become analysts themselves or just carry on with analysis. Now, to repeat the levels of class struggle designated by Althusser a bit earlier, can we not argue that the three dimensions of psychoanalytical process designate the three levels of class struggle within the psychoanalytical practice? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Agon. A very interesting presentation. Thanks for your time. I really enjoyed it. I think at this time we have, it's right now 1:24. If it is okay, Daniel, can we stay till 1:45? So we have a little bit of time for questions. We have a number of questions, some, most of them to Gabriel, some of them to you, Daniel. So would that be okay that we stay till 1:45? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's fine. Just as a reminder to everyone, in 1 hour, we reconvene for panel number 2. So we'll go 15 minutes over to give some space for Q&A. There's great questions. So I think Gabriel can kind of hopefully summarize some things that have already come up, and maybe we should start with him, and then I can jump in perhaps after. And I think, of course, many of the questions posed to me could also be better answered by him. So my proposal would be we extend this session 15 minutes. You still get a break, in between for lunch and things of that nature. So I think it's good.
So that's good. So I think, Gabriel, I think some of the questions are related to each other. So in answering them, probably you can also hint on the other questions. So let's start with the first question. I'm not going to read it out loud in order to save time. So please.
Sure. Actually, I'm not sure how we could do this because I'm not really familiar with the Zoom format, but we can also post them. I think most people don't have access to the questions themselves, right? So there's probably a way just to make them public for people. But I read all the questions. I just broke them in kind of 3 or 4 bigger issues that I think we can address. First of all, I just wanted to thank Agon, Daniel, and Reza for the panel. It actually brought a lot of, I also would have a lot of questions, so hopefully we can reconvene later on and discuss some of this stuff. But for example, Connor asked right at the beginning a question concerning money in the clinic, which is a topic of one of the chapters in the book. I think it's a good kind of segue, especially after Agon's presentation concerning Althusser and so on. So Connor asks about the role of money in the way that it's treated in the book, and I like that he says, well, but it looks like you're saying money has some singular role in psychoanalysis, but doesn't it look like it has that role everywhere? And that's actually precisely my point, right? And I think that this actually addresses some other issues, which is good to clarify, which is the thing that, if you want to look, for example, taking a cue from what Agon was saying and Althusser's remark, right? You guys think you're doing an analytic thing when you're dissolving an institution, but you're just doing a political thing. What is he doing when he does that? He's actually just looking at psychoanalysis as an unspecific part of the world. If it wasn't a psychoanalytic institution, it was simply any other institution, you would still say the same thing, right? What's singular from his perspective seems to be the very elaborate way of pretending like that's not what you're doing, right? So I think that Connor got the right kind of angle, because exactly, When you're buying bread at the bakery, the way money behaves there is not really different from the way that money behaves in psychoanalysis. And that's something we should prefer an explanation of money in psychoanalysis that also fits other places, and not have our own private explanation of the function of money and castration. I mean, why isn't that the case everywhere? Why is that the case only for psychoanalysis? So that's precisely what I try to do in that chapter, which is to give an ordinary description, right? I mean, to put psychoanalysis to the test of an ordinary economic dynamic. And then, of course, something interesting might appear, and I hope that we get to see the sort of economic basis of psychoanalysis in a new light. But at the same time, that novelty or the new way of looking is actually conditioned on embedding psychoanalysis into a quite ordinary description of how you would describe any work, right? So in a certain sense, I actually think that this is what I was trying to aim at. And I think that it's an underdeveloped perspective, which is not psychoanalysis as a singular or a privileged practice, but actually psychoanalysis as a highly ordinary practice. And that's usually the perspective from which other fields see us. I mean, we're really that different from, if you look at us, a doctor or a baker or an Uber driver, are we really that different in any meaningful sense? Only to ourselves. And there is a loss, perhaps, to go to Robert Becharo's question about the jouissance of psychoanalysis. There's a little loss of enjoyment, perhaps, in allowing ourselves to be embedded in the world with no special place. And I think that the book is also a bit of a exercise in that direction. What does it mean for psychoanalysis to be seen as a part of the world and be treated as something that shares many common traits with non-analytic practices, theories, and so on? It's subjected to all the same problems, traps, and so on. And I think that brings me to Hilda's question, which came later on. Hilda asked about the sort of, where should we be critiqued, like where would the imminent critique of psychoanalysis be accomplished from? Like, is it a kind of brainy theoretical exercise? Is it connected to the practice or the praxis, as she says, of psychoanalysis? And I think that my current answer actually has to do with this idea, this ordinary position. You know, this sort of looking at psychoanalysis from the most banal point of view. Of course, many things disappear from view when you look at it like that, but also some things appear. And that's, I think, the interesting part. And it's not and this is, for me, the funny thing. Like, I have a hard time talking about these ideas with people who are well-established analysts. But I don't have a hard time talking about these ideas with people who are young analysts struggling to start their clinic. So these problems, you're dealing with them all the time. How to deal with, for example, a problem that I mentioned many times because I faced it, many of my friends faced it. You know, when you get your first patient who actually pays you okay, like it might contribute to your rent, you know, to see that patient. You know, it becomes much harder to act all Lacanian and interpret with the clinic of the real, the nonsense, because the risk that people won't come back is a real risk. And I mean, isn't it weird that there is absolutely no text in the corpus of psychoanalysis about the fear of losing patients due to money problems and how this interfere in how available for an analytic act that tears asunder the symbolic or whatever, you know? It's a stupid problem. It's a sort of idiotic point of view. And it's actually imminent in the sense that it's quite ordinary to the actual practice. Most analysts are solving these sort of issues all the time, but there is no theoretical absorption of this dimension. So in a way, I'm not trying to propose something new. I'm trying to name something that is part of the material practice of psychoanalysts every day. So that's how I would I address both Connor and Hilda. Yes, it's common. And well, as a communist, that's where I try to start from. Let's start with what we have in common with every other practice. And then if we're lucky, there might be something special about psychoanalysis, but it might not. You need to risk it, and there is a sort of perhaps a sort of narcissistic wound in that, to address Robert's question. Yeah, so the second kind of batch of related questions that I think I can quickly address is Dwayne's. I'm really happy to see Dwayne here. Dwayne's question about the relation between invention, in the sense we're talking about renewals of psychoanalysis, or sort of transformation of analytic thinking in time, and this common kind of notion, not common, but it's a notion that you see from Lacan himself, then Miller picks it up, and other analysts discuss it, where novelty is thought very much in terms of style. And I think there was another question by Daniel Alves who touches on this. Daniel is a really good friend of mine, and he asked the question about Badiou and Badiou's seminars on Lacan, and he makes a distinction that I think is very important. He talks about, isn't this generic perspective, which we're talking about being connected with a sort of ordinary view of psychoanalysis, and the challenge of inscribing something, let's say, extraordinary in the ordinary, right? Isn't this generic perspective concerned with something like the truth about psychoanalysis rather than the truth of the analytic path on the enjoyment or unconscious? And I think that it's helpful to understand Dwayne's question, because perhaps the concept of style, the symptom, and all those other concepts that were already developed to account for the end game of an analysis and so on, they are a good way to limit what they're talking about. So they're usually talking about what's novel for an analysant, right? And what's novel for an analysant can very well be totally codified for psychoanalysis itself. I'm not sure how many reports on the past you guys have seen, like people who finish their analysis and they give an account of it in an analytic school. But there's usually quite clearly this distinction between, and this was a moment of opening, something changed, this was important, and a totally codified structure, theoretical framework to account for what happened coming from the theory, right? So what we're asking ultimately is, what would have to have happened in an analysis so that a report from one's analysis could lead us to change the theory and say, oh, I thought that this always happened this way, but apparently it can happen some other way, right? It's, again, perfectly analytic problem. Under which conditions will we be, in a position to say, okay, so there's some revision in the theory to be done, something that was supposedly universal is just a particular case. We have examples of this from Freud, especially, and from perhaps early Lacan, with psychosis becoming quite different as a category for treatment. But generally, it's very hard to imagine how that could be the case, right? So it's this kind of development of analytic thinking that I'm trying to name, at least include in the field. And I think that it's perhaps people still find useful the idea of style, even though I have my doubts. I think that what I called structural dialectics is very much connected with employing a grammar for philosophical, theoretical thinking that is always bringing metaphors from texts, textual metaphors all the time, the written, the mark. It was an important moment in European thinking. It opened many doors for Marxism, for psychoanalysis and other fields. But I don't know if that's the best way to go about it. And this leads me to the third batch of questions. Again, Dwayne asked something about structural dialectics and this primitive place that otherness would have in it. And how does this relate to the sort of evaluation today that there is a crisis of otherness, which is one of those diagnoses that Daniel was commenting that analysts do, right? And from our small perspective on the world, we're capable of saying that otherness in general is failing in the world, or a new configuration is appearing. So Dwayne asked about this. Yasha asked about the relation between structural dialectics, its limits, and this figure of what I call like an other. I really don't want to turn this into, I hope this doesn't become like a phrase people repeat because it's really kind of cheesy or tacky, you know, but, you know, just this idea that the figure of the other is a secondary, a constituted figure, and it could appear differently. It could be otherwise. It's not the contingent backdrop of everything. It's actually a constituted, localized, situated figure of otherness. And he asks, well, is this what's the limit of structural dialectics and why? And Alex also asked about this, like, how can we talk about this if Lacan talked about there being no other of the other, the problem with meta-language, and so on, right? It's a very classic theme in psychoanalysis. There is no other of the other. The interesting thing is that the theory that I think, the formal approach or the conceptual approach, grammar, that gives us tools to talk about psychoanalysis becoming other to itself, it's also the formal theory that gives a very natural interpretation to what we're talking about in terms of more than one form of otherness or a changing otherness. Because while starting from otherness and defining infinity through it, right, in a kind of Hegelian way, though I don't think that that's necessarily Hegelian in itself, the infinite is the kind of self-sundering other of the finite or something like this. We run into a problem because there's nothing other than this infinity. Whereas if you start from infinity, it's quite easy to talk about there being multiple infinities and there being therefore multiple forms of otherness, which you can construct in weirdly indirect ways, which you can evaluate their relationships. You can talk about if one contains the other, if they're disjunct. You gain a whole conceptual grammar to continue talking about the same topics we were talking about, but with further expressive power. So it's not about letting any of the insights go. It's about expanding the grammar to continue thinking the same problems. So, and funny enough, there's a whole theory about stratification of language, meta-languages, and all of that, which falls into a very different place. And mathematics and mathematical logic have advanced ridiculously since Lacan's time and Lacan's references. In fact, already in his time, there was a lot of interesting developments that could have led to new elaborations. And to conclude, on this point, there's questions by Kade, especially by Kade, and Edge also asked a question about, Kade asked a question about, okay, but what is then speech in general? He reads this text by Badiou, where Badiou criticizes Miller, the text that I mentioned, in a slightly different way, though I don't disagree with his reading. I think it's perfectly compatible. And he said, I understood his question to be pretty much, okay, but what is then speech in general? And my answer is that I have no idea. I don't think, I mean, I'm not even sure if there will be a single answer to that. What I do know is, and I think that here I'm picking up from both what Daniel presented and what Agon presented, is that there is, for me, a big difference between generalization and I think what we could call proper abstraction. And perhaps it's a bit of a childish distinction, the way that I do it, but it's really helpful to me. Generalization, you take a particular case and you universalize it. You take two cases, one of them is actually truer in a more fundamental way than the other, and that's the general point of view. Right? And I think abstraction is when you have two particulars and you ask about what is the common aspect to all of them. The generalization that will appear in this way, it will neither be totally one, not totally the other. It will be something, a third thing, right? I don't think that any serious philosophy today can avoid the fact that speech can behave the way that it does and that people are, you know, as crazy as they are in an analytic session. That's a relevant, very relevant thing to inform further thinking about what is common about the world in any sense. But I think that there are other things that don't appear in the clinic, which are equally as singular and would equally kind of transform what we get to abstract as this broader category of the subject, of speech, of language. So I think psychoanalysis provides perhaps the most radical counterexample to a bunch of false universals, but I'm not sure it is in the position to provide a positive universal. I mean, in this sense, Edge asked the question about my work with a collective and discussion. I have a whole shtick about political organization and if that influenced the book. And I would say that it influenced the book in this way. It's, for me, a serious counterexample that some things that I held to be true in the clinic, in analytic theory, they cannot be universal. There are concrete counterexamples to generalizing things I knew from the clinic. But that doesn't mean I get to call my clinic political. I mean, if you do, you know, if you're organizing stuff, meeting with people, there are more stuff happening there than could ever happen in a small analytic setting, or even in the dissolution of an analytic school. So to conclude, I would say that my critique of Althusser, with Althusser's diagnosis of what Lacan was doing, is that he was doing something more than clinic and less than politics. It's true that it's not an analytic act. He's dissolving an institution and he's doing it in a despotic way. But it's not politics as well. I mean, you know, it takes a bit more effort to do something political, especially in our world. So I would say it's precisely to name what is more than clinical but less than political about the dissolution of the analytic school that I kind of wrote this book. I take a lot of influence from Althusser's intervention. I think it's very inspiring. It touches on something true, but I think it's also codified by Althusser's own over-politicization of certain things, and that, I mean, it's well established from other sources, right? Okay, I try my best.
Thank you very much. I think you answered most of the questions. I just want to remind everybody that we will have follow-on sessions. We keep these questions and we try to organize them in subsequent talks where these questions or other questions that we receive from various different media will be the topic of the conversation. With that, thank you very much for staying a little bit longer. Just a reminder that 3 p.m. we will reconvene in another panel. We have wonderful speakers in that panel as well.